to make another video. I haven't done like a sit down one in a while, and I was trying to think, I was like, I want to do that, but what should I talk about? And I remembered there's something I've been meaning to make a video about since we've kind of overcome it, and that is what I'm going to talk about today, and that is our experience with George's tactile defensiveness. I'll talk a little bit about what tactile defensiveness is, because I had no idea what it was before, but I'll preface this by saying that it's not, for George, it was not a major issue, it was not a huge obstacle, it was just something that we had to work to overcome and took a little bit of help with his team, but it was part of our story over the last few months, so I do want to talk about George's tactile defensiveness. So I'll start by kind of sharing and talking a little bit about what tactile defensiveness is and what it is not and how we kind of discovered it. So tactile defensiveness is essentially a super sensitivity to touch, meaning that textures, you're very aware of textures, you're very aware of feeling, temperature, things like that. I didn't know it existed, and I thought if you were sensitive to textures, it usually meant, my students with autism usually had that, so I thought it was kind of like a signal that you might have autism. It is not that. It can mean that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. So we discovered George, his first signal that George had some tactile and sensory sensitivity was very early on, because bath time with George for the first 6 months of his life was, I mean, to say traumatic is not too dramatic. It was awful. It was a all hands on deck. We prepared days in advance mentally. He would turn so red. He'd burst blood vessels in his face. He would scream so loud. And we tried everything. We did every temperature, every like thing you can buy for baby bath time. He just hated it. So that's kind of, at that time we didn't know, but was a kind of a signal that he didn't like it. Then when he was about 6 months old, he grabbed a toy in therapy, and he grabbed it and then brought his hand back really fast, and he recoiled from the touch of it. It was a very textury toy. I don't remember exactly what it was, but his therapist was like, oh, he didn't like that. Okay, so he might be kind of sensitive to touch. Also around that time though, I had mentioned in passing to our therapist that George was having trouble falling asleep for nap. He was a great sleeper, but falling asleep was really, really hard for him. And I mentioned it just kind of, you know, not expecting that to be anything, just kind of sharing an experience. And she said, his therapist said, well, that might be a sensory thing. That might be because if he has sensory considerations and things like that, he might be having a hard time falling asleep. So she gave us 2 tools for that. So the 2 tools that we got were a soft brush, this guy, and she taught us how to do joint compressions. George is not home, so I can't show you what the joint compressions were, but we started doing those before nap time, and it worked. So we would brush his body with this soft brush and do some joint compressions. That made nap time way easier. So I didn't expect nap time to be a sensory issue, but it was. So once we started doing that, we said, oh, okay, so George responds to sensory things like this. And so that was kind of where we started going, okay, let's pay attention to this and see what's happening. Then when we started introducing George to more food as he was getting older, self-feeding was really hard for him because of, you know, motor skills and stuff like that. But once he figured out that he could pick stuff up and eat it, he only wanted to touch crunchy things like yogurt melts or puffs or salty, you know, snacks. Like if there was any texture to it, he would not touch it. He also would not let us put it in his mouth. So we tried, I mean, there was a few weeks that we tried almost everything. We tried every fruit, anything. And what he would do is he would touch it and then snap his hand back and hide it behind his head. And we would put it in his mouth and he would taste it. So it wasn't a taste issue for sure. It was definitely, he would taste it and then spit it out. And I have a memory, we went to the Great Wolf Lodge in Ohio right before the world kind of shut down with COVID. And George ate some cheese, and he ate it and he chewed it and then just spit it right out. And my brother-in-law laughed because he was like, he did not want that in his mouth. And that was the whole thing, is that George did not want stuff in his mouth. And that got really frustrating because we discovered this as COVID hit. So we discovered this issue as we didn't have therapy services in person anymore. And so we were kind of panicked that we had to kind of solve this new arising issue alone, which is a whole other conversation. But we basically were like, okay, George doesn't want to eat food. He wants to only eat bottles, snacks, and baby pureed baby food, which we were fine. That's okay. And even our occupational therapist was like, that's fine. Those are more than fine. We didn't want to ever make mealtime an unpleasant experience. So we didn't want to force him to eat any of these things. So he had plenty of nutrition with his baby food and bottles, and he was drinking out of a straw. So we were not worried. There was never a point where the stakes were really high that we solved this. It was more us going, okay, this is a very solvable issue that will make George's life way easier, so let's try to figure out what it is. There was never any urgency to solve it, and there was never any really fear behind not solving it. And every time we brought it up to our occupational therapist, she's like, yeah, that's just kind of George. He just doesn't kind of like textures. It's not a Down syndrome thing. It's not necessarily even a different ability thing. It's the idea of if you don't like the sound of nails on a chalkboard, that's a tactile defensiveness. So at that point, we were in lockdown, we were in quarantine, and we were trying to solve George's refusal to eat anything. So what we started doing was kind of introducing textures very gradually and doing a lot of work. So Kyle and I would peel the skin off of blueberries, because he didn't like the skin of the blueberries, but he liked the blueberries. So we were doing stuff like that. We would take a banana and cut it up into really fine pieces so that he would smush it himself and then put it in his mouth. We were always ready with wipes, because if his hands got too messy, he was done. He would, kind of check out. He didn't like his hands to be messy. So we were there to kind of help him. Banana and eggs were the first two things that he kind of started responding to eating. So eggs, what we learned is that George is a flavor guy. We've always known this. George likes really savory flavor. So we put a lot of butter in the eggs. We even put some salt and pepper in the eggs. And once he had a better, once there was more of a stronger taste reaction, he was much more willing to put it in his mouth and then swallow it. Because that was the whole issue. He was putting the food in his mouth. He just wouldn't swallow it. So we started introducing things like that. And then we would start to put down shredded cheese in front of him and let him kind of play with it and make it a playtime activity, so that it was a positive experience, but he was also getting his hands used to it. We would brush him before every single snack, every single meal. Anytime his hands were gonna touch food, we brushed him with a soft brush. I don't know the science behind how the soft brush works, so I don't wanna claim to, but there's a lot of research on it. I have a handout from it somewhere that our OT gave us, but it just made his hands more willing to get messy and get dirty. We knew that he liked the taste of food, like I said, but he just didn't want anything to touch him. So we could feed him SpaghettiOs, loved SpaghettiOs, but he didn't want to touch it and bring it into his mouth himself. So as we started introducing this playtime food stuff, we started giving him more variables in stuff that he already liked. So we'd give him some bananas, but in the bananas there might be some cut up strawberries. And slowly but surely he started understanding that the food was really good. And as he obviously got more teeth, please hold. Okay, that was Kyle calling me to let me know that they're coming home. George got fitted for his SMOs today, his little ankle braces. I don't remember what I was saying. Basically, I'm wrapping up here. Basically, once we figured out the brushing before every meal and letting him kind of play with his food and experimenting with it, it solved the issue entirely. And now George will eat anything we put in front of him, and if he spits it out, it's because he doesn't like it. It doesn't have anything to do with texture anymore. He is not a picky eater, but he does, if we don't brush him before a meal, he won't eat anything. He is at the age where he's starting to put stuff in his mouth that he finds on the floor, but he still takes it out pretty fast. So he's still sensitive to stuff. He likes grass now. He didn't like to feel or touch grass for a very long time, but he does now after the brushing. Bath time is his favorite time of day now. What else? He will play in mulch, he'll play in dirt, he'll play in flowers. So brushing, soft brushing was the key to George's tactile defensiveness. Because he was tactile to more than food. Like, I want to be very clear. He was tactile to if he spit up and got it on his hands, he was mad about it. And if he would get dirt on his hands if he was crawling around outside, he would sit in the grass and just like be miserable. So textures in general, any tactile feeling, he was defensive to. But once we got the soft brush going more regularly, it really solved a lot of those issues for George, and now he doesn't have any of those problems. Also, George is now walking more than crawling, and so his hands are less involved in his day-to-day, so that's also helpful. But George is a great eater. He's always been a great eater, which was something that was a surprise to us, so I do want to say that. George transitioned from breastfeeding to bottle when he came home with us super easily, and he did great when he went from formula and we started adding in like baby food and baby cereal. We never had any issues with anything like that, so we were very surprised to find these issues. And so it was kind of a stressful situation only because we didn't have any therapy services to do it alongside with us, but they were super helpful and everything. So yeah. So that's kind of our story with tactile defensiveness and George's sensitivity to textures and things like that. It was, again, like I said, never a major thing, but it definitely was something that was a part of George that we've all worked really hard. I won't lie, there were really frustrating days on everybody's part. He really wanted to eat. He really wanted to eat, and that was the hardest part, was that he wanted to do these big boy things but couldn't handle it. And that's why we worked so hard to find a solution that worked for him. He is now, I mean, he eats whatever we give him. So he's a great eater. He's a wonderful eater. We're very grateful. So I just wanted to share this because I had never thought about this, and I thought that if a person had sensory, like had texture issues, that it was like a symptom of autism. And George has no symptoms of autism at all. And it's not, it can be, like I said, but it is not necessarily like a signal for autism, which I didn't know. So just wanted to share this little piece of our journey. And yeah, that's all I got for today. So I'm really having fun with making more videos this summer. I'm so grateful. So I'm going to keep doing that. So thank you so much for watching. Make sure you subscribe if you have not, and have a wonderful week. Bye.